In Havana, the ordinary Cuban, the working Cuban, is suffering extreme deprivation on a par with the special period of the 1990s. Electricity, healthcare, all of these public services have been severely degraded because of a series of economic crises before Donald Trump, and the oil embargo just makes it worse. Okay? So, what is the elite doing? Well, the elite is apparently very good at protecting themselves from these kinds of shortages. They have generators, they have solar power, they have a whole bunch of kinds of devices at their disposal so that they can protect themselves. Now, what does the government want? Well, you're right. These talks that are going on in Havana between the United States and Cuba are very obscure. We don't know what's being said except from what's being said in the media. I keep in touch with a lot of people in Cuba, so I hear things. This seems to be what's going on. The government is doing the best it can right now to cut the best deal with Cuba. I'm sorry, with Trump, the best deal it can with Trump. And that deal seems to be something on the order of there'll be some changes to the regime. Maybe we'll get rid of the president, Diaz-Canel. He'll go into exile. And we, the elite, which includes a lot of people with the last name of Castro from the Castro family, we get to stay and we get to enjoy our privileges. The United States, Americans, particularly those who live in South Florida, who are Cuban American and descendants of Cuban Americans, they will be able to invest in Cuba, which had heretofore been outlawed. That's already on the books. That's already a law that has been, that's going to be a change that's coming very soon. So that and the release of more political prisoners seem to be part of the quid pro quo. Are Cuban leaders scared? From what I have read and what I have heard, the answer is yes, very much. Particularly the president goes around now with dramatically increased security. It used to be a relatively short motorcade. Now he's taking armored personnel carriers, ambulances. He moves around a lot, and he also takes along a lot more security. So my sense is, yes, he in particular is concerned about being kidnapped in the way that Maduro was. So just to sum up, I think the government's trying to cut the best deal it can, and I think the report suggests that the Trump administration wants to cut a deal with Cuba. The Cuban security forces, we know they enjoy special privileges. Their officers enjoy special privileges and access to goods. The elite of the military and the security forces are associated with these very large state-run companies that have a piece of just about everything that's profitable in Cuba. So they have a vested interest in the maintenance of the regime. That's something that the Cubans learned and the Venezuelans learned. So we can, I think, hypothesize that, yeah, probably Cuban security forces are very good. They're certainly very good vis-a-vis the Cuban population. But dissent is increasing in Cuba. It's becoming much more visible and much more vocal. I don't know that that's going to move the regime, but I think they have to be a bit concerned about their own people right now, for sure. Of course, one could go broke speculating about the psychology of President Donald Trump. He seems to be very impulsive, and he says a lot of things, and sometimes he follows through, and sometimes he doesn't. That said, yes, you're right. Could be a justification. And it has been. One of the justifications was that this is a uniquely tyrannical regime. I don't think it is, but it's a uniquely tyrannical regime, and we have to do something to liberate the poor people of Cuba. At the same time, media reports say that the Trump administration came to the conclusion, even before the Iran war, or at the early stages of the Iran war, that regime collapse in Cuba was not in their interest. They talk about it. They talk about that regime is going away. I can do what I want with Cuba. Cuba will have a different government. But I think they came to the conclusion that regime collapse was not in their interest because it would provoke a migration crisis. Millions of Cubans could go on the move. They'd go to Venezuela. They'd go to South Florida. That's the kind of crisis that the Americans really don't need. So it would appear that the Trump administration is willing to negotiate with the government and get some things that will allow it to declare victory and walk away. Cubans, I know, elite Cubans are calling this the Venezuela option in Cuba, I am told, which is we'll compromise with the US, but the regime will fundamentally stay in power. So there'll be some change to the regime, but not necessarily regime change. It does look like the Iran war may wrap up. May. I mean, it looks, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen or if the ceasefire will hold, or we don't know what the Israelis will do. We don't know what the Trump administration will do if they get offended or angry about something. We don't know. But if in fact that does happen, it's reasonable to assume that President Trump is going to want something else to win. He's going to want another scalp. He's going to want some trophy on his wall where he can say, look, I just keep winning. And certainly, Cuba is in no shape to resist the United States militarily. It might be able to resist an abduction of its president, but it cannot resist the military force of the United States. So if we see an aircraft carrier or two and their battle groups, or we see an increased military presence in the Caribbean, it's going to be more pressure on Cuba to do what the United States wants. And I think it will work. I mean, I think the regime will give in and try very hard to stay in power while giving the US what it wants. That certainly seems to be what it's doing right now. It will protest. There's rhetoric, there's revolutionary rhetoric, but people in Cuba just don't buy that anymore. I think the Cuban leadership knows that their people want change and they will not necessarily resist the Americans en masse if they try to provide it. Cuban security is pretty formidable and they have advance warning. They know this is something that could happen. So the Cubans might, for a time, be able to fend off some kind of abduction. Might. But yes, American military power is very formidable, and the Cubans themselves, the government, they simply cannot resist anything. They might resist one abduction, but they can't resist continued tries, continued efforts, and they certainly can't resist the American military. There's just nothing there. And certainly Cubans don't want to commit suicide for the sake of a regime that they know has let them down. This is a very different moment for a lot of reasons. One of them is domestic politics. If we can, US domestic politics, if we can believe media reports, we know that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who is a Cuban American, we know that he wants to succeed President Trump as president. In order for that to happen, he wants to obviously look like a success. One way he can do that is by liberating, in quotes, Cuba from the communist regime. That will essentially lock down Florida for him. He's very popular with the South Florida Cuban American community. That will lock down Florida for him, and he'll be on his way to the Republican nomination. So there is a domestic political situation here that is playing to the disadvantage of the Cuban government. It's also unique because Marco Rubio is Cuban American. We've never had that before. We've also, not since the Kennedy administration, not since the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have not seen an American government absolutely and relentlessly committed to changing the regime in Havana by force if necessary. We just haven't seen that. So this is a very new state of affairs. I'm going to Cuba in June, and I want to do some interviews and find out a little bit more about what Cubans are up to and what they want, at least the Cubans that I know. I was supposed to I'm a professor and I take students to Cuba. I do a study abroad program in Cuba, which has been put on hold right now because the situation is uncertain. What I see right now is the most likely scenario, and this can change 2 weeks from now. It can change this afternoon. I don't know. But I see the most likely scenario is that the Cuban government will give in, and they'll do what the Venezuelans did. They will give in to the Americans. They will allow the Americans to claim victory in Cuba. There'll be increased American investment. That could very well begin to lift living standards just by itself. There might be some changes to the embargo, which would be huge and good for the average Cuban. So it's actually for the average Cuban, the next several months could tell the tale where their living standards begin to improve because of investment and maybe a lifting of the embargo. And I think the government is willing to see that happen, the Cuban government. if they are able to stay in charge and continue to exercise control over Cuba and continue to profit from Cuba. Now, the what the exception here, the fly in the ointment, so to speak, is that South Florida Cubans want the regime down. They don't just want investment, they want the communist regime down. And if Trump and Rubio don't do that, they may become angry. They may become resentful. I don't know to what extent that's likely or even possible, but it is, I think, certainly something to think about that they may not be as quick, South Florida Cubans may not be as quick to declare victory as Trump. And that could throw a wrench in the entire situation. We see from President Trump, and again, it's really hard to psychologize someone with or understand his motives. He seems just to want to be able to say that he wins. He seems just to want to be able to say, look, I ended these wars. I ended this war. I ended the Venezuela regime. Mexico does what we want. I have won and I have reshaped the world. That seems to be what he cares about. There is nothing in his background to indicate that he cares about representative constitutional democracy for others, meaning people outside of the United States. And it's not even clear that he cares about it in the United States. He certainly cares about winning. He cares about being a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. He cares about adulation. That's one of the reasons why I think the Cubans could cut a deal with him and with the Trump administration. Will South Florida Cubans go for it? I don't know. We're going to see. Almost any change will be better for the average Cuban. Almost anything would be better.